Hello, folks. Long time no see. I hope you're all doing well. So in this video, I'll walk you through the exam and the correct answers, more specifically to the exam. And after that, I'll show you the correct answers for assignment 2. So let me, in the traditional way that we do things, share my screen with you first. Right. So here you see part of the exam that you all made. So I removed the cover page for this video because that was less relevant here. Sorry about that. This cover page is an obligatory, mandatory thing. Not a very friendly cover page. I hope you didn't get too scared reading that. Right, so then for this exam, right, remember there were 4 parts. And part 1 was carrying out an analysis, at least parts of it, and reporting it. And the first question was to come up, of course, with a research question. And so here, remember that in this case, in this analysis, there were 2 independent variables, right? One between subject factor, which was the different groups of participants who took part in this experiment in the different seasons. And then there was also one within subject factor, namely those different types of words, also season-related words, those 4 different types of season-related words. And that was the within subject factor. And actually, in this research question, both of those things should have been in there. So any good research question, well, maybe almost all of them typically start with to what extent. So that would have been a good way to start your research question. Then it would have been nice if the within subject factor is mentioned, and also the between subject factor. So within subject factor, the processing of those season-related words dependent on the season. That's the between subject factor in which word is processed. So if you would have had a research question like this, you would have gained 4 points. Some things related to this. It's always nice if your research question is not a yes/no question. So if it's not a binary question, therefore using this to what extent is nice. And as I said, what was important is that both those independent variables and the dependent variable actually are reflected in your question. All right, because then we had a between subject factor and a within subject factor and a continuous dependent variable, the mixed ANOVA would have been the correct analysis to do here. If you just said that, you got the full points. If you said a bit more, you also still got the 3 points, as long as mixed ANOVA was in there. Right, then in terms of those assumptions that you have to check for the mixed ANOVA, there are 3 main assumptions, right? So if you mentioned normality for both your independent variables, homogeneity of variance, and sphericity, you would have gotten your full points there. And once those were described in the 3rd question, then in the 4th question, of course, you would be checking those assumptions in your own personalized data set. So here, if you did this correctly, you would have received 7 points in total. So here, then you would be testing the assumption of normality for both of your independent variables. So for each level of your between subject factor separately, and then also first calculating differences between conditions for your within subject factor. So this would have yielded 6 different difference variables. You could have done that using this this Russian name is still too long. This Kokomorov-Smirnov test, or if you would have preferred using skewness and kurtosis, or another reasonable option. So if you said I prefer checking this visually by using those PP plots, for instance, or histograms, that would also have been fine. Well, then you would describe how you would have checked your assumption of homogeneity of variance using the Levine's test, obviously, for your between subject factor. You would have checked sphericity for your within subject factor using the Mockley's test, and you would have reported this. Now, for all those 3 assumptions, briefly, it was expected to report what came out, so whether those assumptions were met or not. And in most cases, depends a bit on your personalized data set, but in most cases, all those assumptions were met. In some cases, it could have been that one of those difference variables that you created did not meet normality, and then it would have been good to report this. And then if you have reported an overall conclusions about the assumptions, that would have been super nice, but I didn't subtract any points if you didn't do that specifically. All right. So that in terms of checking the assumptions, then of course the next part was to report your analysis, and here you could have received 8 points. When you're reporting your analysis, it's always good first to mention once more which analysis you actually did. So typically it would have been good to say something like, I carried out a mixed ANOVA, or a mixed ANOVA was carried out. This was the dependent variable on which it was carried out. Those were the two independent variables. One was within subject vector, the other one between subject vector. Then it's also always a good idea to report the means and standard deviations per experimental condition. Report your first main effect, which was in no case significant. Report your second main effect, which was also never significant, and report your interaction effect, which was also not significant. So on the basis of those three reports, the two separate main effects and the interaction effect, you could then answer your research question. And this answer was basically stating there are no differences between the 4 different seasons in terms of reaction times. And there are also no differences between the separate season-related words. So there are no differences. That's the main conclusion here. If you would have reported that in that way, you would have gotten received full points there. All right, so that was the specific case to start with, part 1. Then part 2 were those basic questions, right? The first basic question is related to the assumption of normality and how you could check this. So as I said, there are different ways in which you can test this, and here the idea was to mention 2. And if you would have mentioned 2 out of those 3 answers, then you would have received 2 points. So one way testing this is this Kolmogorov test. You can also look at skewness and kurtosis, or you can do a visual inspection of your data, or of the residuals in the case of regression using PP plots, QQ plots, histogram, etc. If you would have mentioned 2 out of those 3, it wasn't necessary to mention 3, it was only necessary to mention 2. Then you would have received those 2 points. Then a question to see whether what your preferences are to test whether you have really been doing all those practice assignments and so on. So then you should have just picked one yourself and explained why you prefer this one. And then basically for any reasonable answer, you would have gotten the full points. So some people said, I really prefer the Kolmogorov-Smirnov test because it is objective, because you get a number. It's more objective than just subjectively looking at visually looking at different plots. Perfect answer. It would have also worked the other way around. So you could also have said, well, I like visual inspection of the data. Because this Kolmogorov test, if you have a large data set, it might be significant, even though when you look at the visual information, the data still look normal. So any reasonable answer there, you would have received those 2 points. Another basic question, when you use the Levine's test. So you're actually in all those questions, each bullet point typically represents 1 point that you could get. So here you would say the Levine's test is used to check the assumption of homogeneity of variances. That's correct, 1 point. And then also it would be good to say that this is only for between subject variables. So you only use it for between subject variables. What does it mean when it is significant? Well, it means that this assumption is not being met. And this then means actually that there's more noise or more variance in one of your groups or one of your conditions than in the other. So that would also be important to mention here. All right, then we move to another basic question that we also treated during the course, right? When do you do post hoc tests? When do you do planned contrast? I think almost everyone knew this. So you do a post hoc test when you have no specific predictions in terms of the groups that you want to compare. You basically compare all groups, all conditions to each other, and you do planned contrasts when you have specific predictions or hypotheses for specific groups that you want to compare. All right, question 4, is a multiple regression analysis always hierarchical? There, I think everyone had answered this answer correctly. Everyone was like, no. Multiple regression is not always hierarchical, not necessarily, because it's also possible to enter all your predictors just in one block. So then it's not hierarchical. You just have one model and you check whether this model is better than a random model. What do you do when the assumption of sericity is violated in repeated measures analysis? Yeah, so there you could have received 3 points. So what you do then is report a correction based on this epsilon value. And then based on this value, you would either report the greenhouse geyser or the Reinfeldt. So if you would have mentioned those two options based on this epsilon value, then that would have been a perfect answer. Another basic question about those VIF values. What are the two main signs that indicate that the assumption has been violated? So this is also, this question is literally in the book. So there are two signs there. One is that the average VIF value should not be substantially higher than 1. And no single VIF value should be higher than 10. So those are the two signs that your assumption has been violated. Question 7 of part 2, you check the normality of the difference between pairs of conditions in the way that you also did this in part 1 of the exam. So if you have 4 levels of your within subject factor, how many new variables do you compute? Well, the right answer there is 6. So you need 6 new variables, the same way you did this in part 1. And how did you end up with this number? And there would be nice to mention how you did this. So either you mention all the different pairs, you do A minus B, A minus C, etc., until you have all 6 different comparisons. Or it's also possible to come up with this using a formula saying there are 4 levels. So what you have to do is 4 times 3 times 2 times 1 divided by 4, and then you also end up with 6. But most people just mentioned all the pairs, and that was perfect. Yeah, 4 points for this question. 2 points for simply saying that you need 6, and 2 points for mentioning how you ended up with that number. All right, then question 8. Little study I made up for you to think about. So here, basically the question was, what type of analysis should you do for this data set? And here the right answer was a factorial ANOVA. You could also have said a two-way ANOVA. Why? Because there was a continuous dependent variable that would be critical to mention. And because there were 2 categorical independent variables or factors. And because there was a between subject design. So all those things together make this the perfect study for a factorial ANOVA, for a two-way ANOVA. So 1 point for mentioning the right answer, factorial ANOVA, 1 point for mentioning that the dependent variable is continuous, 1 for mentioning 2 categorical factors, and 1 for the between subjects. So all those things together were necessary for you to conclude that a factorial ANOVA was the right answer here. All right, moving on to the third part of the exam. First question, a bit of a cheeky question about those different checklists that there were. So there were 5 checklists, right? Even though we cover 6 different types of analysis in this course. So why would this have been the case? Well, so first 1 point just for noticing that there was no checklist for the factorial ANOVA. That was sort of a free bonus point for everyone. And basically any reasonable answer here I took as being a correct answer. So the answer I was looking for was, well, because all the checkpoints for the factorial ANOVA were already included in the mixed ANOVA checklist, because the mixed ANOVA is simply a combination of the factorial ANOVA and a repeated measures ANOVA. But if you said something like, well, it might not have been there because we already covered it in the pre-master or in the bachelor, because it was such a cheeky question, I also counted that as a correct answer. Then we move on to regression. What does it mean that your model 1 is significant for 2 points? Yeah, so here the official correct answer is really that model 1 explains significantly more variance in the data than a random baseline model. That's what it means if your regression model is significant, is if the first regression model is significant. The consequence of that, because in this case, model 1 just has 1 predictor, the consequence of this is that this predictor A also must be significant. So if you just mention that, then that predictor A must have been significant. You receive 1 point, but for the full 2 points, you should have said it basically means that model 1 explains significantly more variance in the data than a random null model or a baseline. What does it mean that your model 2 is not significant? That basically means that model 2 does not explain significantly more variance in the data than model 1. Some people said it means that model 2 is worse than model 1. That's actually not the case. So this model not being significant simply means it does not explain more variance in the data than the first model. It can still be equally well in explaining variance, specifically because this first factor is from model 1 is still included in model 2. Which model do you report in detail and why? I was looking for the answer in any case in detail model 4, because that's the most complex model that's still significant. But if you said, well, I prefer to report all models because I just want to be transparent to my reader, that would also have been a correct answer. Okay, but because the question said in detail, I was looking for the answer model 4. But if you said I report everything, fine. That's also a strategy, and that will work. And your reader, most of the time, will like it. And another question that most people, almost everyone answered correctly, if model 4 is significant, doesn't imply that all your predictors in this model significantly explain part of the variance. No, that's of course not the case. It simply means if model 4 is significant, it simply means that it's better than the previous model. That's the only thing. So not all the predictors need to have a significant contribution. It just tells you that this model does significantly better than model 3 in this case. All right, then we move to part 3, question 3. Yeah, so this is really the one trick question in this exam. So any exam needs to have one trick question. I'm sorry about this. If an exam doesn't have a trick question, then it's not an exam. So this question relates to the assumption of Cerissity that was checked in this study. So in this study, there was actually a within subject factor that had 2 levels. Well, and the important thing to realize here is that if your independent variable has 2 levels, then you actually don't have to check the assumption of Cerissity. And if you do this, if you try to check the assumption of Cerissity when your independent variable, your within subject factor only has 2 levels, then you get no SPSS outcome. So that's the undesired SPSS outcome that's referred to here. So if the question is, what should the researcher do here? Well, she doesn't have to do anything, because she doesn't even have to check this assumption, because there are just 2 levels in this variable. Yeah, so this was the one trick question. Apologies if I tricked you, and congratulations to the people who answered this correctly. Then question 4, what's the difference between B values and beta values? So B values really refer to this, the slope of this regression line, right? So in the very first lecture in this course, we talked about this regression line, this regression model. So you can visualize the influence, sort of, well, there's, let's say, the relation between your predictor and your dependent variable as a line. And then this B value really indicates the gradient of this line. Is it very steep or not? So it's really about the strength of the relationship between a predictor and your dependent variable. And the beta values, those are standardized coefficients. B values are not. So beta values are standardized because they're based on standard deviations. And this also makes it possible to compare beta values a bit more easily than B values when you're looking at when you're comparing different studies. So if you said something like that, B values, strength of the regression, gradient of the regression line, beta values standardized and based on standard deviations, then you would have received those points. But here, I mean, here we really get into the more difficult questions of the exam, right? Right, and a question about moderation analysis to see, to test whether you understood, whether you fully understood process moderation analysis. Right, so here the question is, to what extent does a moderation analysis indeed treat your moderating variable as a continuous variable? Right, so remember that you do this moderation analysis using process when your moderating variable is continuous. If it's categorical, you can do an ANOVA, so you don't need process. But actually then what process does, and if you would have practiced a lot with this moderation analysis, you would have come across this also in the practice assignments. It actually turns your continuous variable, so your continuous moderator, into different categories, right? So there's a high, a medium, and a low value of your moderator in your output. So it's actually turning your continuous variable into some sort of a categorical variable. So in that sense, your moderating variable is turned into something a bit more categorical again. Right, so if you would have said that, then you would have received the points here for this question. Question 6 then. Yeah, why is this a poorly formulated hypothesis? Well, so this is typically a hypothesis that we saw during the course for regression analysis, and not so much for an ANOVA. So this is not a good hypothesis for an ANOVA. So an ANOVA really requires different groups or different conditions to be compared, and here there are no different groups indicated. So therefore, this is a hypothesis that would fit better with a regression analysis. The question about the mediation analysis, how can a confidence interval indicate whether there's a significant effect? Well, so if the confidence interval includes the value 0, there's no significant effect. That would have been important to mention. If you would have mentioned that, then already I would have been perfectly happy. You could have said as well that this is a common approach when your data are being bootstrapped, but that wouldn't have been necessary for the full points. Final question of part 3. Again, about moderation analysis, also common to test for the interaction between the independent variable and the moderating variable when testing assumptions. This is also something we saw in one of the longer practice assignments. So here the question was explain why this is conceptually a good idea. Well, that's actually a good idea because this interaction between your two factors, so between the independent variable and the moderator, is actually jointly taken as a predictor in this moderation analysis. So therefore also you need to test this interaction for the assumptions in the moderation analysis, and that's basically the only thing. If you would have understood that, then your answer would have been perfect. But I agree, this was one of the harder questions. Part 4, finally, short essay question. I saw a lot of very nice examples of possible mediation research questions, hypothesis research designs. That was very nice to see many examples, right? Of course, related to social media or smartphones or those kind of things. And also a couple of very exotic ones, also nice. So in principle, it really didn't matter which topic you picked here. So it could have been anything. So the critical thing is that here I really wanted to see whether you understood what a mediation analysis actually does. So here, basically in the final part of this question, it really said what you had to do, right? Describe your topic, why it's interesting, what the research question is, what your hypothesis is, etc., etc. And then actually also those things were graded if they were in your text and whether they conceptually made sense. So if you just described the topic already, you would have received 3 points. If you came up with any reason why this would be theoretically interesting, that didn't have to be any references or so, and if you just explain in one sentence why is this interesting to you, you would have received 3 additional points. Then of course the research question needed to include an independent variable, a dependent variable, and a mediator, because that's what you need in a mediation analysis. Then the essay also asks for a hypothesis, which then of course should make sense in light of your research question, right? And in light of the mediation that you wanted to carry out. And then if you would describe your independent variable and your dependent variable and your mediator, just simply saying what it is, you will receive some points for that as well. And if you describe what kind of data you would want to collect to answer your research question, you would receive some points. So you could have said, I will do a survey for this, or I will do an experiment, and this is what it looks like. A brief description of your potential results. So what results are necessary to answer your research question, and then a link between your research question and the hypothesis. So here, altogether, you could have received 25 points for this. And the critical thing really is showing that you know what a mediation analysis is. So the relation between your independent variable and your dependent variable should be mediated by something else. As we actually also have seen in this graded assignment 2. Right, so this was the exam, more or less in a nutshell, to sort of show you what was expected for the different questions, how many points you could have received, and why for each question. So I hope this helps you trying to understand what your grade is being based on. And also, if you want to take a resit, then also, of course, you can use this for preparing for the resit, because for the resit exam, the structure of the exam will be very similar. All right, so that was the exam. Then the second part in this video, I'll also show you what some correct answers for this graded assignment 2 look like. So those grades you already received, I think a week ago now. And there I've kindly requested from one student who really did this assignment 2 very well, whether I could share their answers, just to show you what a more or less perfect reply to assignment 2 would have looked like. Before starting to do that, let me remind you of the instructions for assignment 2. So here you see copied from the instructions what was actually expected for assignment 2. So this was in the instructions. And those are then actually also the things that you were graded on. So for each case, the idea was to report a method section, including several things, a results section, including several things, and a brief discussion section, also including different things. And then basically for all 3 cases, this is what you were graded on. Except, I should say, the method section for case 2, of course, would have been almost exactly the same as for case 1. So if for case 2, you would have said the method section is exactly the same as for case 1, then that would also have been fine. Because just copy pasting, that would have been possible, and some people did that, that was also fine. But if you just mention, well, it's the same as case 1, then there was no need to just copy it. All right. Then let's go to this worked out assignment 2, case 1 graded assignment. So for case 1, obviously then it starts with the method section. And here I marked in yellow the things that were necessary to include in your report. So for case 1, and in basically any method section that you will write, certain things are always necessary to include, and you could receive points for this. So in the method, you would, for instance, say how many participants there were in your study. And here in this case 1 was a survey study, right? And that's also always one thing that's good to mention. So if you write a method section, it's nice to say actually what kind of study you did. Was it an experiment? Was it an online survey? Was it just an observation? So you would have received 1 point also just for mentioning that it was an online survey. Then it would have been important to mention, to describe your participants, how many male and how many female participants there were. This is something you could have deducted from the data set that was there, and to report the average age of your participants. So in this case, that was 34.7 years old. Also report the standard deviation. After this, the next part would consist of describing the different scales that were used. And there, for each scale, I was looking actually for this Chromebox alpha value, which is something you do very well, virtually all of you. I think you were very well trained in doing this in the pre-master and the bachelor courses on statistics. And also for each scale, I was looking for the mean score on the scale and the standard deviation. So if you included that with a short description of what each scale looked like, then you would have received points for that. And just for one of those scales, so the perceived ease of use, it was important to say that there was one item that was that needed to be reversely recoded. So there you also would have received 1 point just for mentioning that. There's also, this is a very detailed, but it's important to mention that it's reversely recoded, not just recoded. So you can recode it in many ways, but it would have been important to say you recoded it in a reverse way, reversing the scores. Many of you did this. So here that's for the first scale, and then I was looking for the same things in the second scale, perceived usefulness, same thing for social influences, same thing for technology anxiety, same thing for privacy concerns, and then finally also for the dependent variable, intention to use technology to have a medical video consultation. Would have been important to report the Chromebox alpha and also the mean score and the standard deviation on this scale. Right, so that would be the next part of this report in the method section. And then one thing I was looking for, because it was also in the instructions, was the descriptive statistics for each scale in this case, and also the correlations, importantly, of the predictors and the dependent variable. So that was also one thing that was necessary to report, and that was most nicely reported in a table. So here you see an example of what such a table could look like. So there, and many people of course did this, there it's nice to report your different variables, the predictors and your dependent variable, and show how they correlate with each other. It's nice to have those kind of asterisks underneath the table, below the table, to sort of show whether correlations are significant or not. And this is what this could look like. Actually, in those kind of tables, it's not necessary to completely fill the table. So you know that the part higher than the diagonal here is just the reverse of the part below it. So it would have sufficed to just report only the bottom part of this table here. Right, and of course, it's also important to have a certain header for your table with a description what it is, and to report this above your table. So not below it, but above it, saying this is table 1 and this is what's in the table. All right, that's the method section for case 1. So those were the different things I was looking for there in your report. Then let's move on to the results. So there are different ways to analyze the data for this case 1. And there are different ways of doing this correctly. So one correct way of analyzing your case would be to do one regression analysis with 3 different models. And then the first model would have 2 predictors, the second model would have 2 predictors, and the third model would have the final predictor, social influences. So that would be one correct way. Another correct way would be to do 2 separate regression analyses. So if you did 2 separate regression analyses and reported those, that would also be a correct answer to this case. So here we'll look at the 3 different models in one analysis being used. So that's the first thing I looked for. How did you do this analysis, and did you do this correctly? So if you had 3 different models, first model, perceived ease of use, perceived usefulness. Second model, technology anxiety and privacy concerns. And third model, social influences. That would be a typical correct way of answering this question. Then many people reported testing for assumptions. Again, as of course, after having taken this course, you are very familiar with how important checking all your assumptions are. Actually, in the instructions, it didn't say that you had to report those. And also, when you will be reporting your master's thesis, it's actually good to check those. It's necessary to check those for each analysis that you do. But if they are being met, you actually don't have to report them. So also here, because it's not in the instructions, it wouldn't have been necessary to report your assumptions and the outcomes. So we're just going to quickly skip that part. And then we get to the report of your results. So then, of course, it's nice to first report your first model and the outcomes of your first model. So this first model always was a significant model, so a significant improvement over the null model. And if you did the analysis in this way, then you would have ended up with this R-square value. It's critical that here in your degrees of freedom, it would start with a 2. This would mean you would have done things correctly. Certain value, and this also shows that your first model is significant. Second model then would have been a statistically significant improvement over model 1. Also important to report this. Again, degrees of freedom here starts with a 2, and then this number here is 2 lower, because you now have 4 predictors in your model rather than 2. Nice to report the change in R-square and also report that it's significant, explaining how much variance it explains. And then finally, this third model was not a significant improvement over the second model. So also good to report that it was not a significant improvement. Well, then a nice thing to do is to take the most complex significant model and report more specifically the contributions of each individual predictor of that model in your text and also in a table. So there I was looking for the effect of each independent variable. So you would say, perceived ease of use is no significant predictor here. You would report it. Perceived usefulness is a significant predictor. Technology anxiety is also a significant predictor, but privacy concerns is not a significant predictor. So there's 4 predictors. You would also report individually their results in the text and also in a table. So there you would have the B value, the beta value, of which you now know what the difference is, standard error, standard deviation, and also potentially confidence intervals and the significance value. So there again, I also looked for this table. If you included all this information in the text, that would also have been fine, but it's just more convenient to put it in a table like this. All right, that's the report for case 1. In the discussion, again, because it was in the instructions, I was looking for the aim of this study. So you mentioned again what the aim of the study was, what were the predictors, what's the dependent variable, and then you start reporting on the hypothesis again, right? So here you really report were their hypotheses confirmed or not, were they rejected? So in this case, you should have rejected hypothesis 1 and explained why, not rejected hypothesis 2, explained why, support hypothesis 3, explain why. And for hypothesis 4, you would also say it was confirmed. And then apart from those 4 hypotheses, remember that there was also a research question, right? So it's also a good idea to answer this research question in your discussion. All right, so that were that's more like the conclusions. And then also, because the instruction said so, I was looking for limitations, potential limitations of the study and ideas for future research. And this may have been a bit harder because, of course, you were just given this data set with a description. And therefore, I've been quite flexible with what I took as being a correct answer. So for a maximum of 2 limitations mentioned, you could have received 1 point. So if you came up with 2 potential limitations of the study, so for instance, perhaps the ecological validity of this study is not very high, or perhaps more people should be tested in different age groups, those kind of things, you would receive 2 points. So 1 point for each potential limitation that you discussed. And also for each of 2 ideas of future research, you would receive 1 point. So you could say future studies might not look into this using a survey, but perhaps an experiment. Or future studies could look at different age groups and test the same things, those kind of things. For 2 of those future ideas, you would have received 2 points, 1 point for each future idea. All right, that was case 1. In case 2, as I said, the method you could just have copied. So you wouldn't receive any new points for the method section here. Also, if you did something wrong in the method section for case 1 and copied it here, I didn't subtract any points there. So I just completely ignored the method section here and immediately went to the results because the method section for those 2 cases was virtually the same. So here, case 2 was this mediation analysis, right? So here in the results, again, it would be good to mention what the mediating variable was, what your predictor was, and what your dependent variable was. And that's always a nice way to start your results section, to remind your reader what actually you did. So you would say, I carried out a mediation analysis using process. This was the mediator, this was the predictor, this was the dependent variable. And then again, you could have reported the assumptions again, but this was not necessary because it was not asked for in the instructions. So then let's go to the output, so the results of your mediation analysis. So here your mediation analysis will give you an overall model that has a certain quality, a certain fit. And that's the first thing that you report. So this model in this case, perceived ease of use as the predictor, perceived usefulness as the mediator, and your dependent variable as the dependent variable was actually an improvement over the no model. That would be good to report in this way. And then actually in this model that you will also have drawn visually, there are those different paths, right? So for each path, it would be good to simply report what the result was, to find those elements in your result output the process gives you, and then report it here. So here, for instance, it's reported in this way that there was a significant effect of perceived ease of use on the mediator, perceived usefulness. So this is this very first pathway in your model. So you report this and explain what it means. So ease of use predicts usefulness. Actually, also usefulness predicts then your dependent variable. And that is reported here. And actually, there was no significant effect of perceived ease of use directly in your dependent variable. So those are your 3 pathways in your visual model, in your conceptual model. Then there are 3 more things to report here. The significant total effect, so that's the effect of your total model. Your indirect effect, so the effect via the mediator, which was significant. and your direct effect, which was, it's here called insignificant. I would say that's non-significant. So a non-significant direct effect. All right, so if you take all those things together, it was an effect of your predictor on your mediator, was an effect of your mediator on your dependent variable, but no direct effect. And this actually already tells you that there was a mediation. So your effect of your predictor on your dependent variable is fully mediated by your mediator. That's what you would have gotten from this analysis, reported in this way. All right, then of course I was looking for this conceptual model that should have looked like this. So there are those three pathways, right, in the model. Here, there should have been the B values and the significance values, and also the indirect effect should be here, direct effect and total effect should be here, and there should be a legend for your conceptual model below the figure. So for figures, you always, in APA style, you put this below your figure. So this is what it should have looked like. If everything was in there, full points for the conceptual model. All right, then discussion, same thing as before. So first discuss the aim of your study again, confirm hypothesis one, explain why. So as I said before, you should have said this effect of the independent variable on your dependent variable is fully mediated by your mediator, perceived usefulness. If you explained why this mediation effect was there, then you would have received full points for this. And then again, 2 potential limitations and 2 ideas for future research. If you came up with something that made sense, you received points for this. All right, final case. So now we're moving from survey research, which was case 1 and 2, into experimental research, which was case 3. This was this case about those knowledge-related and emotionally meaningful appeals, right? So here again, it would start with the method section, which is a different method section as before. So again, it would be good to mention your different variables. So here there was a between subjects independent variable because there were 2 groups of participants. There was one within subjects variable. It would also be good to mention what that actually was here. And there was a dependent variable, the recall of information. That's what was tested in this experiment. Also, again, I was looking for the number of participants in this study, which you should always report, their average age. One thing that's actually missing here in this model is that you should also have reported the age range. So here it is reported that participants were on average 70 years old with a certain standard deviation, but it would also have been good to report that they were in the age range between, I think from the top of my head, it was between 61 and 94 years of age. It's also something you should always report. All right, then let's move on. Then I was also looking again for a table with the means and standard deviation per experimental condition in this case. So that would have been good to make a table like this with just the mean score per condition. So for the emotionally meaningful appeals, they would have been in 3 different contexts, right? And the recall score would have been good to mention like this with a standard deviation between brackets. Same for the knowledge-related appeals. One other thing that would be nice is to also have a total score here, which could have been added here in table 4. All right, that with regards to the method section, things you would have received points for. For the results section, again, it would be good to explain what analysis you actually did. So here you would say, I performed the mixed ANOVA. This was the between subjects variable. This was the within subjects variable. And this was the dependent variable. Here again, some information about the assumptions, which was in this case not necessary to report because it was not in the instructions. And then here we get to the results of your mixed ANOVA. So here actually there were 2 main effects that you could have tested for and 1 interaction effect. So it would be good to report those. So if you first reported a significant main effect of type of appeal, report it in this way. And then also explain what it means. So there was a significant main effect, meaning that because there were just 2 levels, you could conclude from that emotionally meaningful appeals resulted in better recall of information than knowledge-related appeals. So also report the mean scores here and the standard deviation. And this actually supports the first hypothesis. Then there was a second significant main effect, in this case of type of context on the recall of information. And this independent variable had 3 different levels. And therefore, you should have carried out planned contrasts, because the specific hypothesis actually already had specific predictions. So you shouldn't have done any post-hoc tests here, but you should have carried out planned contrasts. And also you should have reported those. What you then should have reported is that commercials in the context of leisure were significantly better in terms of recall compared to commercials in the context of work. And also commercials in the context of health did significantly better than commercials in the context of work in terms of their degree of recall in those participants. And this actually is completely in line with hypothesis 2. So also hypothesis 2 is supported. And then finally, there was also a significant interaction effect. So basically everything was significant in this case. So you report the significant interaction effect. And here actually you report the corrected degrees of freedom in this way, because this, I should say this correctly, because this test of Cerissa was being significant before that you checked in the assumptions. You shouldn't have reported this in great detail, but you should have corrected the degrees of freedom here because it was significant. This actually also holds for the, right, here you go, for the significant main effect type of context. There also you report the corrected degrees of freedom in line with this Greenhouse-Geyser correction. All right, anyways, we had a significant interaction effect. So also this is something you should follow up then, right? Because you can report that there is a significant interaction effect, but then you don't know yet what this actually means. So there you also would have looked at the specific contrasts in your output. And then this also, your findings should have been exactly in line with the hypothesis. So there is a significant difference between those emotionally meaningful appeals and the knowledge-related appeals in leisure and work contexts, but not in the health context. Yeah, that was it. So looking at your output, this is then what you should report with the means and the standard deviations again for each individual condition in your results. That also means that hypothesis 3 is supported. So all 3 hypotheses are supported. And then also it was asked from you to make a graph. This is one way an interaction graph could have looked like. Some important things there. So it's always important to actually mention what's on your y-axis. So recall of information. Also specifically mention what is on your x-axis here, and also include a legend saying what's in your graph. So those are different things that should have been in there. So you shouldn't have left the standard SPSS text here, but you should have adapted it to actually show your reader what this graph is all about. This is one way your graph could have looked like. It could have also been the other way around. So now type of appeal is plotted here, but you also could have switched the x-axis here with this legend, and then you would have had a different graph, but that would still be correct. Right, so there were actually 2 types of correct graphs here possible. Again, with a nice legend saying what the figure is below the figure. All right, final part. Again, in the discussion, you should say the study aimed to investigate, and then say what it actually investigated. Confirm hypothesis 1 and say why it is confirmed. Confirm hypothesis 2 and say why it is confirmed. Confirm hypothesis 3 and say why it is confirmed. Again, mention 2 limitations, mention 2 ideas for future research. If those were reasonable, then you receive points for that. So you could have said, well, this was an experiment, so it might have been good to also check whether those results hold in more naturalistic contexts. You could have said, this was a study on older adults. It might be good to check whether it holds for the entire population, so also include younger people. And then that already would be an idea for your future research, right? Do this experiment outside of the lab in a different way, and maybe look at different age groups. All right, so that was then an explanation of assignment 2. So I hope now on the basis of my explanation of both the exam and assignment 2 that you more or less get an understanding where your grade comes from. Let me then for now stop sharing my screen. If you have any remaining questions, of course, still, as you know, you can always contact me. If you want to have more information, just let me know. And apart from that, I very much hope that you are going to have a very nice summer. And if you're still going to be around after summer for a second semester in the master, then I hope you find this course useful, and you will hopefully find out that it's useful in the context of your master's thesis. And of course, also best of luck with it. All right, then let's see if we meet again, hopefully on campus when that's allowed again. Bye.